Chapter 1: Whispers of Betrayal. The growing tension. The sun beat down on the cobblestones of Jerusalem, the air thick with the scent of roasting lamb, incense, and sweat. Weeks before Passover, the city throbbed with a feverish energy, a chaotic blend of religious fervor and simmering discontent. The usual cacophony of merchants hawking their wares, donkeys braying, and children squealing was amplified, a soundtrack to the burgeoning tension that hung heavy in the air like the dust kicked up by passing sandals. This was not just the usual pre-Passover bustle. A deeper unease permeated the city's pulse, a tremor of apprehension that ran beneath the surface excitement. For those who knew, a shadow stretched long and dark over the vibrant tapestry of Jerusalem's life. The whispers started subtly, exchanged in hushed tones in the shade of olive trees or within the crowded confines of the marketplace. Talk of a radical preacher, a man named Jesus, who challenged the established order, whose popularity threatened the authority of the Sanhedrin, and whose very existence seemed to stir the wrath of the Roman occupiers. Even the air seemed to crackle with the electricity of impending conflict. In the bustling marketplace, the scent of spices and perfumes mingled with the metallic tang of Roman armor, a constant reminder of the power that held the city in its iron grip. Roman soldiers, their faces impassive behind their helmets, patrolled the narrow streets, their presence a silent but potent force, their very stillness a warning. The disciples, huddled together in the shadows of the temple, felt the weight of this pressure acutely. Their faces, etched with a mixture of excitement and fear, reflected the growing unease. Peter, usually boisterous and confident, was unusually quiet, his eyes darting nervously around him. His hand instinctively went to the worn leather strap of his fishing net, a familiar comfort in this atmosphere of mounting dread. He glanced at James and John, the sons of Zebedee, who were engaged in a hushed conversation, their faces grim. Andrew, ever practical, paced restlessly, occasionally murmuring a prayer under his breath. The air was thick with unspoken anxieties, with the unspoken knowledge that the path they had chosen to follow alongside Jesus was fraught with peril. Thomas, ever the skeptic, voiced their collective concerns. "Master," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. The Sanhedrin's anger grows with each passing day. Their words are laced with poison, their intentions dark as the night. His eyes, sharp and observant, scanned the bustling crowd, searching for any sign of impending danger. The others nodded, their silence confirming his words. Even Matthew, the tax collector, usually quick with a joke or a sharp observation, was subdued, his face pale and drawn. Jesus, however, remained calm, his gaze peaceful as he looked upon the surging crowds in the marketplace. He seemed to sense the growing storm, to feel the tremor of fear rippling through his followers, but his expression betrayed none of this. His words, however, held a subtle warning, a note of quiet foreboding. "Fear not," he reassured them, his voice a gentle balm in the turbulent sea of their anxieties. "The path ahead is narrow, the road arduous, but the destination promises salvation." Yet even in his calming words, a subtle undercurrent of apprehension could be detected, a faint tremor in his usually resonant voice, betraying the weight of the knowledge he carried, the burden of the events soon to unfold. The tension wasn't limited to the disciples. The air crackled with it even among the ordinary people of Jerusalem. The murmurs and whispers spread quickly, like wildfire in dry grass. The religious leaders, entrenched in their power and threatened by Jesus' growing influence, were actively spreading fear and doubt, painting him as a heretic, a threat to the established order, a man who should be condemned. Their words, carefully crafted and filled with carefully placed half-truths and exaggerations, poisoned the minds of the easily swayed. The Roman authorities, ever watchful and ever pragmatic, also felt the growing unease. They viewed any disturbance to their rule with suspicion, their military might a potent tool to quell any sign of rebellion. The whispers about Jesus reached their ears as well. Was he simply a religious figure, or did he harbor rebellious intentions? The Romans preferred to err on the side of caution, and their growing surveillance of Jesus and his followers was a constant reminder of the looming threat of Roman power. As the days drifted into weeks, the mounting tension became almost palpable. The vibrant hues of the city seemed to dim, the joyful sounds replaced by an undercurrent of fear and apprehension. The disciples, despite Jesus' reassurances, found themselves increasingly isolated, their every movement watched, their every word scrutinized. They felt the eyes of the Sanhedrin, the eyes of the Romans, and even the eyes of their fellow citizens upon them, a constant, stifling pressure weighing them down. The growing tension was not only a physical feeling but also a psychological one. Sleep became elusive, replaced by anxious dreams and unsettling thoughts. The disciples found themselves constantly glancing over their shoulders, their hands instinctively reaching for weapons that were not there. They had seen the anger in the eyes of the Pharisees, the cold indifference of the Roman soldiers, the subtle, insidious way the whispers of betrayal had begun to weave themselves into the fabric of their community. Even among themselves, cracks of doubt and suspicion appeared, fueled by fear and exhaustion. The once tight-knit group now felt fragmented, their unity shaken, threatened by the darkness closing in. The shadows lengthened, mirroring the deepening gloom in their hearts. The festive preparations for Passover offered little comfort. The air that had once hummed with hope and expectation now whispered ominous forebodings. The scent of roasting lamb couldn't mask the grim certainty that something momentous and devastating was about to occur in Jerusalem. The city, once a place of vibrant life, was now caught in the suffocating grip of fear, a fear mirrored in the hearts of Jesus' followers. And in the midst of this growing tension, a single figure, wrestling with his own demons, walked the streets of Jerusalem, his fate, and the fate of those he followed, hanging precariously in the balance. The whispers of betrayal were no longer a secret. They were the city's mournful dirge, an unsettling prelude to the events soon to unfold. Judah's inner turmoil. The flickering lamplight cast long, dancing shadows across the rough-hewn walls of the small room, illuminating dust motes swirling in the stagnant air. Judas Iscariot sat hunched on a low stool, his head bowed, his hands clasped tightly together. The silence was heavy, broken only by the occasional scrape of his chair against the uneven stone floor, a sound that echoed dissonantly in the oppressive stillness. Outside, the sounds of Jerusalem, the distant cries of vendors, the rhythmic beat of a blacksmith's hammer, the muted murmur of the night were muffled, distant, as if separated by a thick veil of sorrow. He wasn't praying. Prayer, in the conventional sense, had become a foreign tongue to him, a language he could no longer speak with sincerity. His heart, once a fervent vessel of faith, felt now like a desiccated wasteland, parched and barren, its once flowing spring of devotion choked by weeds of doubt and despair. The weight of his secret pressed down on him, a crushing burden that threatened to suffocate him in its suffocating embrace. The betrayal, the thought itself, once a flickering ember in the recesses of his mind, had grown into a raging inferno, consuming him from within. It wasn't merely a decision. It was a cancer, eating away at his soul, poisoning his every thought, twisting his very being. He wasn't a monster, not inherently. He had followed Jesus with a fierce, if flawed, devotion. He had witnessed the miracles, felt the power of the Master's presence, experienced the profound transformation his teachings had wrought in the lives of others. He had believed, profoundly and deeply, in Jesus' message of love, forgiveness, and redemption. But now, doubt gnawed at the edges of his faith, a relentless tide eroding the foundation of his belief. The problem wasn't just a lack of faith, but a gnawing hunger, a desperation born of more mundane concerns. Poverty had been a constant companion, a shadow that stretched long and dark across his life. He remembered the sting of hunger, the cold bite of winter without adequate clothing, the constant struggle to make ends meet. He had been a man of simple means, always scraping by, always worried about tomorrow. And the demands of following Jesus, of leaving behind his previous life, had only intensified this financial hardship. The relentless pursuit of discipleship had meant sacrifice, a sacrifice that was beginning to feel unbearable. He recalled the looks of quiet judgment from some of the disciples, those subtle shifts in their gaze that conveyed both pity and an unspoken disapproval. It was their implicit superiority that felt most humiliating. They seemed to exist on a different plane, sustained by some unseen source of faith, while he struggled with earthly concerns. He saw Peter's almost childlike trust, unburdened by the weight of financial worry. He watched as the sons of Zebedee seemed to have their every need met, their lives seemingly untouched by the harsh realities of the world. He envied their seeming spiritual immunity to these worldly anxieties, their lack of worry about the daily grind that weighed down his own soul. This wasn't some grand conspiracy against Jesus. No, this was about Judas and his very survival. It was about finding a way out of the suffocating grip of poverty, to alleviate the ceaseless, gnawing anxiety that threatened to overwhelm him. The 30 pieces of silver were a glimmer of hope in a sea of despair, a chance to escape this life of hardship, of poverty, of feeling like an outsider, even amongst his own companions. He told himself it was a pragmatic decision, a harsh but necessary action to ensure his own well-being, a choice born out of desperation and driven by the most basic human need, survival. He closed his eyes, trying to conjure up the image of Jesus' face, to recapture the gentle warmth of his gaze, the unwavering certainty in his voice. But the memories were clouded, obscured by the fog of his inner turmoil. He could still recall the power of Jesus' teachings, the moral authority that resonated with his own heart and soul, but even those memories felt tainted now, tainted by the bitter knowledge of his own impending betrayal. He tried to rationalize his choice, to justify his actions to himself, but the words felt hollow, empty. His justifications were a frail shield against the relentless onslaught of guilt. He knew, deep down, that he was betraying not just a man, but a cause, a belief, a hope. He was betraying the very thing he once believed in with every fiber of his being. A sob escaped his lips, a choked, ragged sound that broke the oppressive silence. He buried his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking with the force of his silent grief. The weight of his decision, the crushing burden of his betrayal, threatened to shatter him completely. He was alone in his despair, utterly alone, adrift in a sea of remorse, with no solace, no comfort, only the gnawing weight of his own guilt. The betrayal had begun subtly, almost imperceptibly. It wasn't a sudden, explosive act of treachery, but a gradual erosion of loyalty, a slow, insidious poisoning of his faith. The seeds of doubt had been sown long ago, nurtured by his personal struggles, his growing sense of isolation, and the ever-present gnawing hunger in his belly. He remembered his initial encounter with Jesus, the awe he had felt at the Master's power, the profound impact of his words. It had been a life-altering experience, a turning point that had filled him with hope and purpose. But over time, as the pressures of daily life mounted, those feelings began to fade, replaced by a growing sense of disillusionment. The financial anxieties never eased. Instead, they multiplied. The discipleship demanded a considerable sacrifice, a commitment that stripped him of his ability to provide for himself, leaving him in a perpetual state of financial insecurity. He saw others who seemingly had their needs provided for, their faith seemingly protecting them from the harsh realities of the world around them. This widening disparity between his own struggles and the perceived ease of his companions added to his sense of isolation. He was torn, burdened by the conflicting demands of faith and survival. Then there were the arguments, the clashes of personalities amongst the disciples, the squabbles over position, the power struggles, the simmering jealousies. These conflicts mirrored the broader tensions within Jerusalem, creating an atmosphere of unease and suspicion. This dissension within the ranks further eroded Judas's faith, feeding into his growing sense of isolation. He felt increasingly marginalized, a silent observer in a group that was steadily losing its sense of unity. He tried to speak, to express his concerns, but his words seemed to fall on deaf ears. He sensed a growing distance between himself and the other disciples, a subtle coldness in their interactions. His attempts to voice his frustrations were met with either silence or a dismissive wave of the hand. His anxieties and frustrations were dismissed as signs of weakness, a lack of faith. This silence only deepened his sense of isolation and despair, fueling the growing resentment in his heart. The whispers started subtly, exchanged in hushed tones amongst the Pharisees and Sadducees. He heard them, the veiled accusations, the insinuations about Jesus, about his power, about the potential threat he posed to the established religious order. These whispers, once distant murmurs, slowly began to permeate his own consciousness, twisting his perceptions, clouding his judgment. The pressure mounted, the weight of his secret intensified, threatening to crush him. He felt trapped, caught in a web of desperation, his sense of agency shrinking with each passing day. The 30 pieces of silver weren't merely a bribe. They were a lifeline, a desperate attempt to escape the crushing burden of his own anxieties. The lamplight flickered again, casting a longer, more distorted shadow across the room. Judas shivered, not from cold, but from the icy grip of despair. He knew he had made a terrible mistake, a decision that would forever stain his soul. But the die was cast. There was no turning back. The path of betrayal, once a dark possibility, had now become an inescapable reality. The city of Jerusalem slept, unaware of the turmoil in the heart of one of its inhabitants, a turmoil that would forever change the course of history. A Last Supper foreshadowing. The air in the upper room hung thick with the scent of roasted lamb and unleavened bread, a stark contrast to the growing unease that settled over the small gathering. The low stone walls seemed to press in, amplifying the silence that punctuated the hushed conversations. Outside, the sounds of Jerusalem, the distant bleating of sheep, the rhythmic clang of a metalworker's hammer were muted, muffled by the weighty atmosphere within. This was not simply a meal. It was a sacrament, a prelude to an unknown future. Jesus sat at the head of the rough-hewn table, his gaze sweeping over his disciples, a mixture of tenderness and sorrow etched onto his face. His eyes, usually sparkling with life and warmth, held a depth of sadness that pierced the hearts of those gathered around him. He knew what was coming, the shadow that loomed over their fragile fellowship, threatening to shatter it completely. The disciples, usually boisterous and eager, were subdued, their usual banter replaced by an uncomfortable silence. Peter, typically impulsive and outspoken, sat with his hands clasped tightly together, his usual bravado replaced by a nervous stillness. John, ever close to Jesus, leaned forward, his eyes fixed on his master's face, a silent question hanging in the air. The sons of Zebedee, usually vying for attention, sat quietly, their faces reflecting a deep concern. Even James, known for his forthrightness, remained silent, his expression unreadable. They were like sheep sensing the approach of a wolf, their instincts screaming of impending danger. A collective apprehension hung in the air, heavy and palpable. The bread, broken and shared, was more than just sustenance. It was a symbol, a testament to the covenant they had shared, a fragile bond about to be tested to its limits. Each bite was a reminder of the promises made, of the sacrifices endured, of the faith that had brought them together. But this time, the familiar ritual felt different, imbued with a profound sadness, a premonition of impending loss. Jesus' voice, when he spoke, was soft, but his words carried the weight of centuries. He spoke of love, of forgiveness, of the trials that lay ahead. His words, usually filled with joy and hope, now carried an undercurrent of sorrow, a hint of the sacrifice he was about to make. He spoke of the shepherd who lays down his life for the sheep, a metaphor that resonated with a deep sense of foreboding in the hearts of those who listened. Judas, seated across from Jesus, felt the weight of his secret pressing down on him, a crushing burden that threatened to suffocate him. He shifted uneasily in his seat, his eyes darting around the room, avoiding the gaze of his fellow disciples. The guilt gnawed at him, an insidious poison that slowly eroded his ability to participate fully in the ritual. His inner turmoil mirrored the storm that raged within Jerusalem's walls. The city was tense, on the brink of conflict, much like the delicate balance within their small fellowship. He watched as Jesus, with infinite tenderness, washed his disciples' feet, a gesture of humility and love. The act was a ritual of cleansing, a reminder of forgiveness and selfless service. But for Judas, it served as a stark reminder of his impending betrayal, the purity of this act contrasting harshly with the darkness that consumed his soul. Each gentle touch from Jesus' hand intensified his inner conflict, exacerbating his guilt and torment. The act of humility only amplified the magnitude of the impending betrayal, highlighting the immeasurable price of his decision. The silence stretched, heavy and thick, filled only with the clinking of cups and the occasional sigh. Each disciple, caught in the grip of unspoken apprehension, wrestled with their own thoughts and fears. The wine, shared in the sacred ritual, seemed to mock Judas. Its sweetness and symbolic significance turned sour and bitter in his mouth. He tasted the bitterness of betrayal, the acrid taste of regret, and the iron tang of impending doom. Jesus' eyes met Judas's, and in that brief, silent exchange, a world of unspoken understanding passed between them. Jesus' gaze held no accusation, only an immeasurable sadness, a profound sorrow that pierced Judas's soul, a sorrow that was not for himself, but for the profound disappointment that was about to occur. This exchange was a silent acknowledgment of the betrayal, a shared recognition of the impending tragedy, and a poignant understanding of the profound loss it would bring. The disciples continued to eat and drink, the ritual progressing with a sense of almost unbearable tension. The meal itself was ordinary, yet its context transformed it into a solemn, significant event, a Last Supper steeped in the bittersweet anticipation of both companionship and imminent separation. Jesus, in his own quiet way, seemed to sense the approaching storm and attempted, with a tender and loving heart, to prepare them for the trials to come. The unspoken conversation that took place that night was as important, perhaps even more so, than the words that were spoken. The atmosphere was pregnant with unspoken knowledge, a shared consciousness of the impending tragedy hanging heavy in the air. Each glance, each silent pause, spoke volumes. They were a small band of followers, united by their faith, their belief in a man who had shown them compassion, hope, and love. Yet now, they stood on the precipice of betrayal, a betrayal that would test the strength of their faith and the resilience of their bond. Jesus began to speak of his imminent departure, his words filled with a bittersweet sadness. He spoke not of defeat, but of a greater purpose, of a sacrifice necessary for the redemption of humankind. His words were a prophecy, a solemn promise of his return. Yet, even as he spoke of hope and resurrection, a deep undercurrent of sadness permeated his tone, a somber acknowledgment of the suffering that lay ahead. He painted the picture of a painful end and the promise of a glorious beginning. His words were heavy with the understanding of the suffering he was about to endure, but still, there was an undeniable conviction in his voice. The weight of this moment, the solemnity of this gathering, hung in the air like incense. The simple act of sharing bread and wine transformed into a profound and sacred ritual, a poignant symbol of unity and fellowship in the face of impending betrayal. The quiet conversations, the shared glances, the unspoken fears, these were the silent components of a final farewell, a last act of love before the storm broke and their lives were irrevocably altered. The shadows deepened, mirroring the growing sense of impending doom as night settled over Jerusalem, a city poised on the edge of chaos and change. Judas, haunted by his decision, watched Jesus with a growing sense of despair. The warmth and compassion radiating from his master only heightened his inner torment, deepening his sense of guilt and sorrow. He tried to find some justification, some shred of hope to alleviate the burden of his actions, but found none. The weight of his betrayal pressed down upon him, suffocating him with its immense gravity. As the meal drew to a close, a palpable tension filled the room. Each gesture, each word, was imbued with a profound significance that transcended the simplicity of the act. This was more than a meal. It was a covenant, a testament to their faith, and a prelude to the impending storm that would engulf them all. The Last Supper was not just a historical event, but a deeply emotional moment, a crucible where faith, doubt, and betrayal intertwined, leaving an indelible mark on their hearts and the course of history. The echoes of this night would resonate through the ages, a timeless testament to the power of love, forgiveness, and the enduring struggle between light and darkness. The unspoken words, the silent gestures, the palpable tension. These were the true essence of the Last Supper.